Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today we have a new poll from Emerson College Polling for the 2025 New York City mayoral race, and it finds that Zohran Mamdani leads Andrew Cuomo, Curtis Sliwa, and Eric Adams in the mayoral election, and in a head-to-head matchup versus Cuomo in the hypothetical scenario. So Emerson College Polling, one of the most reputable polling sources in the United States, also just recently did a poll on the Boston mayoral race as well, who just had his preliminary election back on Tuesday, and I do have a video coming out as well in the future on that one. Now, in that poll, Emerson actually got the actual margin result essentially 100% accurate in that race. So I am putting a lot of stock into this New York City Emerson College poll. So the poll finds that New York City voters find Democratic nominee Zohran Mamdani with 43% of support in the November election for mayor, while 28% say they support the former governor and independent candidate, Andrew Cuomo. 10% support Republican Curtis Sliwa, 7% support incumbent mayor Eric Adams, with 9% still undecided. And this is what the numbers look like displayed in kind of bar chart style here. So just looking really close here, obviously plus 10 points to get him to 38, plus an additional 5. Mamdani's leading over Cuomo by about 15 points in this race. And just doing the math here, the way the race has been going, this is consistent with a lot of other polls that we've seen. That 9% undecided, even if Cuomo won every single one of those undecided voters, the math is not there to defeat Zohran Mamdani in a four-person race. Zohran Mamdani has a high enough floor of support where most polls show him now getting in the low to mid 40% or so. He hasn't hit that over 50% number yet, which is good news for the anti-Mamdani voters, but Zohran Mamdani is now at that low to mid 40% range, where in a four-person race, there's not enough outstanding vote to stop Zohran Mamdani. Now, in a head-to-head matchup, there could potentially be a scenario where that's possible, but just look at the numbers here. Cuomo at 28, Sliwa at 10. If you combine them, that would get to about 38%. Eric Adams at 7. Add 7 to 38, you get 45. At that point, that'd be about 2% over Mamdani, with still 9% undecided. So that's kind of the reality of this race right now, is in a lot of my videos, I've been going off the assumption that Sliwa and Adams, if they dropped out, their voters would all support Cuomo. That's actually not a very big guarantee, which is there are a lot of New York voters that are still very upset with the job Andrew Cuomo did as governor, that even if Sliwa and Adams dropped out and endorsed Cuomo as the anti-Mamdani candidate, they may still refuse to vote for Cuomo just out of political spite for how he was as governor. So even if Mamdani and Cuomo faced off, it's still potential those 9% undecided could break a good number of them for Zohran Mamdani, and we'll be getting into that later in the poll. In Emerson's first general election poll of the New York City mayoral election, Mamdani starts with a 15-point lead over Governor Andrew Cuomo, said Spencer Kimball, the executive director of Emerson College Polling. Mamdani has a 29-point lead over Cuomo among voters under 50, leading 49% to 20%. And that lead strengthens to 6 points among voters over 50, leading 39 to 33. Those who say they are very likely to vote in the November election break for Mamdani 46% to 27%, while those who say they are somewhat likely to vote break for Andrew Cuomo 34-27. 77% of voters say they will definitely vote for the candidate they chose, while 23% think there's a chance they could change their mind and vote for someone else. Now, this is where things get very interesting here. Zohran Mamdani voters are locked into their candidate. 85% will definitely support him, compared to 74% of Sliwa voters, 72% of Cuomo voters, and 66% of Adams voters. Several head-to-heads were also tested in a matchup with just Mamdani and Cuomo, and it found that 47% supported Mamdani and 40% supported Cuomo, with 13% saying they are undecided. Now for Mamdani versus Mayor Eric Adams, a much larger lead for Mamdani here. And this one, Mamdani breaks 51%, Adams only has 30, 19% undecided. So even if Adams won every single undecided voter, it would not be enough. Zohran Mamdani would win that matchup. For Mamdani versus Curtis Sliwa, it's like the Eric Adams one, but even worse for Sliwa. And this one, Mamdani gets 52%, 28% for Sliwa, 20% are undecided. This, again, is very consistent with a lot of other polling that we've seen. which is that Eric Adams and Curtis Sliwa have no chance at defeating Zohran Mamdani in a head-to-head matchup, and them being in the race is really only playing spoiler to Andrew Cuomo even having a chance at defeating Mamdani in this race. Now, Mamdani versus Cuomo is still significant that Mamdani versus Cuomo is a 7-point lead for Zohran Mamdani with 13% undecided. There is enough undecided vote left out there for Andrew Cuomo to defeat Mamdani, but at 13%, there's also a realistic scenario Mamdani gets enough of that undecided vote to win. Because to win this race, at this point, with at 47%, Cuomo at 40%, Cuomo would have to win a large percent of that 13% undecided. Where if Cuomo or Mamdani essentially gets to 50%, he could essentially win this race really without too much of a problem. So what you're going to see here is Cuomo has to essentially win roughly 11 of that 13% of undecided voters to really win this race. It could go 50-50, and then at that point you're basically looking at a few votes here and there to see what happens, but Cuomo would need to win a vast majority of those undecided voters. And that is a very tall task for him to do, especially given his popularity issues in polling. Where Mamdani is the most favorable name recognition of the candidates, with 48% having a favorable view of him, while 34% view him unfavorably. While Cuomo holds a 36% favorability rating, while 51% view the governor unfavorably. That's the issue here. Two things are true in this race. Andrew Cuomo is the most popular and best alternative candidate to Zohran Mamdani in this race in terms of actually beating him at the general election level. Where at the same time, Andrew Cuomo is also increasingly very unpopular, and Zohran Mamdani has the popularity advantage over Cuomo. So much so that even if Cuomo gives the anti-Zohran vote the best chance at winning, Cuomo still may very well lose in that matchup due to his own unpopularity. Now for Eric Adams, it's even worse. 26% favorability rating among his constituents, while 61% view him unfavorably. Just to give you an idea here, President Donald Trump, who is a Republican, who even though New York City is his hometown and his home city, obviously President Republican, very unliked, here he has a 31% favorability rating, while 64% have an unfavorable view. So that's right. Based on the actual numbers here, Eric Adams is more unpopular in New York City than Donald Trump is, which gives you an idea of what his chances at becoming mayor here. Where for Curtis Sliwa, he is also unpopular by a large amount, 24% favorable, 45% unfavorable, but with Sliwa, 31% of respondents say they are unsure, by far the most unsure in this race. A plurality of voters, 42%, think that their community safety is no different than it was 4 years ago, while 39% think their community is less safe, only 19% think it is more safe. This question was also asked in the Boston voters ahead of the city's mayoral preliminary election. 45% think their community in Boston is more safe, 21% said less safe, 35% said no different, which again could be playing into the unpopularity issues for Eric Adams. It also says that 2/3 of New York voters, 66%, support a 2% tax on those earning above $1 million annually, while 18% oppose. Mamdani voters support a 2% tax, 81-5, while Cuomo supporters support a 2% tax, 56-30. 43% of New York City voters say their family finances are worse off than a year ago, while 41% think they're about the same. 17% say they're better off compared to May of 2025. Those who say they are worse off have decreased by 6 percentage points, while those who say they're about the same have increased by 6. New York City voters think the economy, 27%, threats to democracy, 25%, are the top issues facing the U.S., followed by healthcare at 11%, crime at 11%, and housing affordability at 9%, and immigration at 6%. This Emerson poll was conducted with PIX11 and The Hill, and the New York City survey was conducted between September 7th and 8th, and a sample of 600 New York City voters with a margin of error of 3.9%. Okay, so there's a lot to take away from this poll, and I've kind of been going through it throughout the video and throughout the poll as I've done so. But the more polls that come out in this race show a pretty consistent trend in this New York City mayoral race for 2025, which is this is the most competitive New York City race we've seen in a while now, and that is because this is the first one that's not a Democrat versus a Republican in New York City. In 2021, Adams was the Democrat, Sliwa was the Republican. It's New York City, massive Democratic win. In this race, you essentially have 3 Democrats running against each other and 1 Republican. And that's why this race is so competitive, because a lot of Democratic voters are split between Mamdani, Cuomo, and Adams. Now, a few trends have become apparent in this race, which is Zohran Mamdani right now seems to be the likely favorite to win, because multiple polls that have come out are showing very similar numbers and similar trends. A Quinnipiac poll that just came out a few days before this one shows Zohran Mamdani around 45%, not too far off from Emerson's 43%. In this one, Cuomo is 23 and Emerson's 28. Sliwa is up to 15, Adams up to 12, 4% undecided. But again, the problem remains, which is there's too much support for Zohran Mamdani and not enough support out there to stop him with Sliwa, Cuomo, and Adams all in the race. The math just isn't there to stop him in this race. And that trend has become very apparent over the last few months here. Whatever amount of anti-Zohran Mamdani vote there is in New York City, it's not enough for one candidate alone to win when the other two candidates are also in the race. And that's why when you see matchups for Cuomo versus Mamdani, who Cuomo is the leading second-place candidate to Zohran Mamdani right now. Curtis Sliwa has been polling pretty consistently in third place. Eric Adams has been polling pretty consistently in fourth place. And that's where, if everything remains constant in the race and all the candidates stay in, I expect we'll see it finish like that. Where Mamdani right now is leading in the Real Clear Politics average and the Decision Desk HQ average by around 15 points. And based on the polling data, it certainly seems to be tracking towards that regard. Now, there has been rumblings for a while now that President Trump is trying to get Mayor Eric Adams a job in his White House administration and to get Adams to drop out of the race to give a better opportunity for Cuomo to win. As President Trump is probably no ally of Andrew Cuomo, but would rather have Cuomo be the mayor of New York City than Zohran Mamdani. Now, even if Adams drops out of the race, this is the problem for the anti-Mamdani vote. Because let's go with the polling average where Adams is getting 10.5%. If that is taken out and all of those votes are added to Andrew Cuomo, well, that brings Cuomo up to about 34.8%. That's good. He gets him a lot closer in striking distance versus Mamdani and is enough undecided other vote to potentially be in range of defeating Mamdani. But he's still down about 5 points, which means Curtis Sliwa's 15.5% is again playing spoiler in this race and stopping Cuomo from having the best possibility to actually beat him. Now, this poll from Emerson is very striking. Again, after the Boston mayoral race, I already held Emerson in high regard on their polling, but I think also this is pretty important to take away, which is versus Mamdani and Cuomo, Mamdani still starts out with a 7-point lead. So even whether it's Cuomo or President Trump or whoever, even if they get the race down to Mamdani versus Cuomo, there's still a really good possibility Zohran Mamdani may just win outright. Now, it is possible also that Adams and Curtis Sliwa, even if they dropped out, their names would still remain on the ballot. So they may be getting 2 or 3% vote or so that vote for people that vote for them anyway, who are not paying attention to this race super closely and don't know that they've dropped out, and that alone could play spoiler in the race. That's a very under-talked about situation. But even if they were to drop out of the race, Andrew Cuomo in this poll still loses by 7 points. Again, meaning he can only afford to lose realistically about 2 to 3% of that undecided vote without winning this race based on this numbers. So it's very interesting that even in the head-to-head, Mamdani may still defeat Cuomo. But the fact remains, Cuomo presents the anti-Mamdani vote the best opportunity at winning this race. So what happens from here? We'll have to wait and see. It's September 12th. The election is going to be in early November. Certainly this race is very interesting right now. I think if the election's held today, Zohran Mamdani wins and by around that 15-point margin. If Eric Adams drops out of the race, I think we see a more competitive election where Mamdani wins somewhere around the 5 to 10-point range. I don't think we're going to see Andrew Cuomo win all of Eric Adams' supporters, but I think we're going to see him win a pretty large majority of them. But again, with Mamdani, Cuomo, and Sliwa in the race, the math is not there, I don't think, for Mamdani to lose. Now, if Sliwa drops out, this race gets a lot more interesting. Cuomo could win, but again, I think Zohran Mamdani narrowly leads even in that regard, like this poll showed. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe. If you did, leave a comment below, tell me your thoughts, and hope to see you in a future video. Hello everyone, and welcome to today's video. Today we have an interesting story out of the state of Maine, where Democratic Governor Janet Mills has reportedly begun interviewing staff for a possible Maine Senate bid. Now, this is very significant, as I remember when I was covering the days and weeks leading up to the Roy Cooper announcement in North Carolina. We saw a report a few weeks before he announced that he was interviewing staff for a potential campaign bid as well. So this doesn't mean 100% Janet Mills is going to obviously run for the race, but it does mean at very least we're starting to see some momentum move in that direction. Now, the article from Punchbowl finds that Maine Democratic governors in the process of interviewing campaign managers for a potential Senate run. As the article says, a sign that she is moving closer to challenging Senator Susan Collins, a Republican from Maine, according to sources familiar with her plans. Now, Janet Mills, a popular two-term limited governor, has been flirting with a Senate run for months, while other Maine Democrats have eagerly jumped in the race against Collins. Mills hasn't made any final decisions about whether to run in 2026, but she's growing more serious in her consideration, a person familiar with Mills' thinking told us. Should Mills launch a bid, she'd be the latest in a string of recruitment coups for Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer and the DSCC. These include former Senator Sherrod Brown in Ohio and former Governor Roy Cooper in North Carolina. At an event earlier this week in central Maine, Mills openly praised Susan Collins, telling reporters she appreciates everything Collins is doing. But at the same time, Mills certainly sounded like a Senate candidate, saying, "Every day I pick up the newspaper and I read the headlines and I watch the news. And there are a lot of very disturbing things going on in Washington," she told reporters. Mills has said she's aiming to decide by November whether to challenge Collins. Mills moves now to ready her political operation and secure key staffers are an indication she's leaning towards a run. Now, Mills will be 78 years old on Election Day and a possibly awkward standard bearer for a Democratic base eager for generational change. If Mills chooses to run, she'll have to navigate a Democratic primary that does include brewery owner Dan Kleben and oyster farmer Graham Plattner, who Plattner, as we've seen in recent weeks, been getting a lot of attention from national Democrats and on social media as well, getting the endorsement already from Senator Bernie Sanders. Now, Mills does start out with higher name recognition and solid approval ratings after 2 successful gubernatorial bids. People who know her say Mills is eager to run for another office, but felt obligated to consider it, especially after she sparred with President Donald Trump over the transgender athletes issue at the White House earlier this year. As Punchbowl reported, Senate recruitment in Maine has been complicated by Collins' stature. Few elected Democrats are eager to take her on, and the race to replace Mills in Blaine House, which is the capital in Maine, has tied up much of Maine's Democratic bench. This is very important here, and this is a point that's been made in several of the videos where I've gone over this. Collins is the only Republican senator up for re-election in a state that Kamala Harris won in 2024. But the long-serving Maine Republican is a formidable foe, dispatching Democrat Sarah Gideon in 2020 despite an avalanche of Democratic money and being written off by many pundits. And I believe if you go back in time to my own videos back in 2020, I do believe I did have Susan Collins losing that race as well. So just be transparent on that. So this is very interesting. And again, we've been talking about the Senate race for a lot of weeks now. If you're a returning viewer of mine, you know I've been covering this race very closely. Because this is honestly, I think, one of the most fascinating Senate races in the country, really because how open it is. Because when you look at the Senate map in 2026, especially like places like North Carolina, you know it's going to be very close. You know it's going to be Roy Cooper versus Michael Whatley. It's going to be an absolute nail-biter of a race. Jon Ossoff in Georgia, going to be facing off against one of the Republicans. Going to be a very close race. The Democrat probably has a slight advantage there, but it's going to be very close. Maine is such a wild card because despite it being one of the top targets for Democrats in 2026, it's almost kind of being a little bit under the radar right now. Janet Mills entering this race, I think, would certainly change that. But Maine's a very interesting state because at the presidential level, it just voted for Kamala Harris over Donald Trump by about 7 points. That is a likely Democratic win. At 7 points, it was about a point more blue than New Jersey and Virginia, and then it's also about 3 points more blue than Minnesota. So it's not exactly a battleground state, though it was back in 2016 against Hillary Clinton, where Clinton won it by about 3 points, but there was a lot of third-party vote. Joe Biden in 2020 won it by about 9, and in 2024 voted for Harris by about 7. So 3 elections in a row now, Maine has been under 10 points for the Democrats versus the Republicans. So it's not a super blue state, but it's not really a battleground state either. And this is the comparison I want to make here, you look at some of the other Republican senators who defeated Republicans who defeated Democratic incumbents in 2024. Jon Tester in Montana and Sherrod Brown in Ohio specifically. Look at how the states voted in 2024. Donald Trump won Montana at the presidential level by about 20 points. Donald Trump won Ohio against Kamala Harris by about 11.2. But the Senate races were much closer. Tim Sheehy defeated John Tester by 7 points. Sherrod Brown lost to Bernie Moreno only by 3.6. And these states voted a lot more for Trump in 2024. Now, Maine is very interesting because even though you could flip this and say, well, the Democrats, based on 2024, should have a great opportunity at winning this race, and seeing as it is less red than Montana and Ohio was, with the situation flipped around, Collins should probably be in more trouble than Brown and potentially Sheehy were. But also, Maine's interesting in that its other senator, is actually independent Angus King, who caucuses with the Democrats. So Maine does things a little bit more quirkier at the Senate level than a lot of other states too. Now, in 2020, Susan Collins was able to win against Sarah Gideon by 8.6%. Now, obviously, that is a very big number, but something that doesn't get talked about a lot in this race is that Susan Collins, despite winning by 8.6%, got 50.98% of the vote. The Democrat Sarah Gideon got 42.39%. And when you look at how the results ended up breaking down, Susan Collins won on the first round of voting. Don't forget, Maine utilizes ranked choice voting. So Collins, this ended up being the end result, as she got 50.98%, and won. Gideon, the Democrat, only got 42.39%. With two other independents in the race, Lisa Savage and Max Lynn, Savage getting almost 5% of the vote. So if Lisa Savage and Max Lynn were not in this race, there's a real possibility Susan Collins still wins this race, but wins by a much smaller margin than that 8.6% on face value. And you would have to assume, with Janet Mills being the governor of Maine and holding likely higher favorability ratings and also higher name recognition numbers than Sarah Gideon did back in 2020, and much more prowess at fundraising, this is going to be a more competitive race than it was in 2020, where it ultimately ended up being. But I think we're using a little bit revisionist history on Maine Senate race for 2026, as the polling actually showed Sarah Gideon likely to win this race. She had a 3.8% lead on the 270 to 1 average, 6.5% in the Real Clear Politics average. Just to give you an idea here, the polling data for Florida's 2024 Senate race for Rick Scott, where he ended up winning by about 13.5%, the polling in that Senate race was under the margin, was smaller than what Sarah Gideon led over Susan Collins when everything was said and done in this Senate race in 2020. So Sarah Gideon, based on the Real Clear Politics polling average, looked to be a lock to win this race. And look at all the polls heading into October in the final month of the campaign. They all showed Sarah Gideon winning, and by a large margin, showing her around the low to mid 40% or so on the first round, and then after ranked choice voting, Gideon would be winning over Collins by a very large margin. And this was pretty consistent. The last time Susan Collins led in a poll, you'd have to go back to June of 2020. That was the last time. Gideon led in every single poll or is tied in every single poll from then. And what ended up happening, obviously, we saw Susan Collins pull off a big upset as the incumbent and win with 50.98%. Now, it needs to be talked about for the Senate race because this is going to be, despite how close 2020 was, this is going to be the toughest fight that Susan Collins has ever faced. And it is worth noting she has not even officially announced that she is running again in this race, though she is eyeing a sixth term and giving a lot of indications that she'll probably run. But she has not officially entered, but she probably will. The Democratic side right now, if the Democrats, like a Graham Plattner, were to advance to the general election, I think he would probably be in a similar situation to Sarah Gideon, where he would have a large amount of national Democratic support, and he would still have a very strong chance at winning this race. But as a first-time candidate, does not have the proven track record of winning statewide like Janet Mills does. Which is why, when I talk about this race, it's essentially like having Maine's version of Roy Cooper or Ohio's version of Sherrod Brown running in this Senate race. And you have to give the Democrats credit here, because the Democrats, at least for 2026 thus far, seem to be doing a very good job at recruiting top Democrats. Chuck Schumer gets a lot of hate from a lot of Democrats, especially a lot of younger Democrats. But when it comes to getting top-tier Democratic candidates who are electable in their state to run, he's gotten Sherrod Brown, he's gotten Roy Cooper, he may be getting Janet Mills as well. He's fielding very strong Democratic candidates from a candidate quality standpoint, of people who've gotten elected statewide before, hold decent approval ratings, and would have a chance in a general election. And Janet Mills appears to be the latest name in this potential regard. Now, no polling data has been done yet for this race, but you can already see this race is very much going to be a very close one. Inside Elections has it as tilt, Cook Politico and Sabro Crystal Ball have it as lean for the Republicans, Rachel White House has it as toss-up. If Janet Mills enters this race, I would not be shocked one bit to see this rating all shift to toss-up across the board. Now, for Maine itself, Susan Collins, as I mentioned, won by 8.6% in 2020. This was down from 2014, where she won by 37 points. So obviously, based on those numbers, it got a lot less red in that 6-year span, showing as American elections have become more polarized in a state like Maine, even though Collins won by a lot back in 2014, she only won by 8.6 in 2020. Now for Janet Mills, she won re-election in 2022 against former Republican Governor Paul LePage outright on the first ballot by 13.2%, a very large, likely Democratic win, in a Republican midterm year, mind you. In 2018, Janet Mills first got elected governor in Maine by 7.7% against the Republican Sean Moody, again on the first ballot. Now, the Democratic primary, there were a lot of candidates running as well, but Janet Mills, the Attorney General of Maine at the time, did ultimately end up winning this primary and ultimately ended up winning by a pretty large amount. Now, in the first round of voting, it looked pretty competitive, where Mills had 33.1, Adam Coate 28.1, but after ranked choice voting went into effect, we ended up seeing Mills winning 54.1 to 45.9. Still not a massive win for Mills, but obviously good enough for her to go on to win and advance to the general election and then win this general race. Where for Mills, it actually looked like a toss-up from some rankings, leaned to likely for some others like Sabado's Crystal Ball and 538, having it as a lean Democratic flip. The polling on this one, not a lot of polls were conducted, though it did show Janet Mills leading by a pretty large margin, and she won by 7 points. Emerson had her winning by about 8, so again, right around that margin that it ended up being. So why am I showing you this? Because I think the Maine Senate race in 2026 has the potential to be like another Senate race from 2018, where it was the Senate map here from 2018, where Republican Governor Rick Scott defeated Democratic incumbent Bill Nelson by 0.12% of the vote. Rick Scott, heading into this election as the governor, had decent approval ratings for the time, but was running against a Democratic incumbent in what was going to be a very close race. And the polls went back and forth through this race, so much so there was never really a clear indicator which candidate was going to win heading into the final election. Now, as you can see early on, it started out with Nelson leading, but then as things got closer, take your pick. Democratic win, Republican win, Democratic win, Republican win, back and forth really, even through Election Day. And ultimately it led to a super close race. Rick Scott only won by about 10,000 votes, and what was to many a shocking political upset that the longtime Democratic incumbent lost to the governor of the state. And I'm saying this because, tell me if that sounds familiar. 2026, the Senate race in Maine, you may see the governor of the state running against the incumbent U.S. Senator, who the incumbent U.S. Senator in their party believes that she probably cannot lose, while the Democrats are thinking if they run a good candidate, that they can win. I think Maine Senate race is going to be very close, and if it's Janet Mills versus Susan Collins, may very well end up being the closest Senate race on the 2026 Senate map. For right now, in my current rankings, until Janet Mills officially enters this race, I do have it listed as Susan Collins in the lean Republican column. But I would not be shocked one bit come November of 2026 to have Janet Mills defeating Susan Collins by under 1 point in Maine Senate race when everything is said and done, like Florida's 2018 Senate race. Because I don't think this, even with 2026 likely being a strong election environment, I really don't think this is going to be like a Susan Collins gets blown out type election. Getting over 50% of the vote in 2020 last time was still very significant, and though Collins probably has a bigger chance at losing in 2026 than she did in 2020, I think it's still going to be very close. But I do think Janet Mills presents the Democrats a stronger opportunity, even if not winning on the first ballot, at very least, keeping Susan Collins under 50%. Because depending on if any third place candidates run, getting under 50% and going to ranked choice voting is likely going to be how the Democrats win this. It's possible Janet Mills wins outright, but against a Republican incumbent, I think it's more likely than not it goes to ranked choice voting, and that's how Mills ultimately wins, which again, I think leads it to being a little bit under 1%. We saw something kind of similar to this in the House race in Maine's 2nd District in 2024, where Jared Golden won by 0.55%, where on the first round of voting here, we can actually see the results, where after ranked choice voting, Golden ended up winning 50.3 to 49.7. On the first round, it was like Golden had 49.3, Thorold had 49, and then it went to ranked choice. I think we may see something very similar in the Senate race in 2026. So for now, I'm leaving it as lean Republican, but if Janet Mills enters, I think we very quickly could be talking about this race being a tilt Democratic win. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you did. Leave a comment below, tell me your thoughts, and hope to see you in a future video. Hello everyone, and welcome to today's video. Today we're talking about the state of Minnesota, and news that Tim Walz has reportedly indicated that he will run for governor of Minnesota again at a Democratic fundraiser. Now this is very big and obviously is very important news for 2026, though this should be mentioned that Walz did not officially make a public statement like where he would post online saying that he is running again. This is just what he told at a Democratic fundraiser. But the article from the Minnesota Former says that Governor Tim Walz made it clear that he does intend to run for an unprecedented third four-year term in front of a group of 100 or so Democratic donors last Tuesday, according to two people who were there. In his speech at the Iron Ranger Bar in St. Paul, Walz said something to the effect of, "You'll all hear making contributions, and you'll probably know I'm not going to run off to Mexico with your money, so look out for an announcement," according to a source who attended the fundraiser and whose account was confirmed by another person there. He said, quote, "You made it clear he was moving in that direction," said a person in attendance. The reformer spoke to 4 people who were at the fundraiser or have spoken to Walz about his plans in recent days. They were granted anonymity because they were not authorized by their employers to speak publicly. Walz has also told several people privately but definitively that he will run again and he will make it a campaign announcement next week. A Walz spokesperson declined to comment. A DFL source who's at the event said Walz was thrown off by the June situation involving Representative Melissa Hortman. I don't want to say the word in case of like demonetization, but this is the word that the article says, who was a friend and governing partner, but the recent, again, same word, at Annunciation Catholic Church, where school children were gathered for a celebratory mass, lit a fire in him because he wants to provide leadership during another vulnerable moment in Minnesota history. Despite the advantages of incumbency, a robust fundraising operation, and his own natural political skills, winning a third term won't be easy. Walz would have to defend a lengthy record during which he governed during some of the state's worst crises, the pandemic and resulting academic declines. What happened with George Floyd, again, I don't want to say the words because I don't want to try and get demonetized or risk it by YouTube or anything, but what happened with George Floyd and the uprising and rioting that followed. A spike in crime that has since subsided, emerging fiscal instability, and finally the political violence that happened with Hortman and her husband Mark and badly wounded State Senator John Hoffman and his wife Yvette. Another crisis has been the state's government's own making. A wave of fraud in public programs is sure to be a centerpiece of Republicans' campaign against it. Representative Kristen Robbins, a Republican candidate for governor from Maple Grove and currently the chair of Minnesota's House Fraud Prevention Committee, said Walz has allowed rampant fraud in his own agencies. A third Walz term would be a disaster, and I'm stepping up to make sure that doesn't happen, Robbins said in a statement to the Reformer. I am committed to stopping the fraud, restoring fiscal responsibility, and bringing back common sense leadership so the state works for Minnesotans, not against them. Scott Jensen, the 2022 GOP nominee for governor, and Kendall Qualls, an Army veteran and healthcare executive, are also running as GOP candidates. Qualls said Walz's first 2 terms as governor have been nothing but a failure. Recent polling suggests that Walz remains popular with Minnesotans, but they are less pleased with the idea of him running for a third term. A June KSTP poll found that only 43% of Minnesotans surveyed said he should run again. Despite Walz's challenges, he has also enjoyed the highest of highs. A surprising easy 2022 re-election and a Democratic farmer-labor trifecta that resulted in a bevy of legislative victories from free school meals to driver's licenses for undocumented people, legal marijuana to huge investments in transportation and housing. He parlayed that record in a few high-profile national media appearances to emerge as Kamala Harris's surprising pick to be her vice presidential nominee. A national media and public speaking tour earlier this year fueled speculation about a 2028 presidential run, but he has already ruled out and said he will not be doing that if he wins a third term. The last time Minnesota voters were faced with a governor seeking a third term, They rejected Iron Range Democrat Governor Rudy Perpich in 1990. Okay, so this is obviously very interesting and has important news for 2026. Tim Walz sounds like he's going to be running again. Other Democrats that could run if Walz did not include Melvin Carter, Keith Ellison, Senator Amy Klobuchar could decide to run for governor and leave the Senate if she wanted to, Erin Murphy, and Steve Simon. Though with the news that it sounds like Walz is going to running again, it really shifts to the Republican side for the most competitive things. Now, I think the Republican most likely to win again would probably be Scott Jensen, as he was the Republican governor in 2022, so he has been able to win a Republican primary before. Though it is worth noting that he did not win the general election, so there could be a little bit, maybe of, I would say, anger against him or anti-incumbent sentiment against him, as he did not win the general. The next Republican, Kristen Robbins, as the article mentioned, is running as well. She's probably second place right now. Brad Kohler, a retired MMA fighter, and he was part of the UFC ranks and DEEP, is also running in this race, with also Jeff Johnson, Phil Parrish, and Kendall Qualls as well. The only other two Republicans that have expressed interest are Julia Coleman, a state senator and daughter-in-law of the former U.S. Senator Norm Coleman, so that could have a political family involvement that maybe help her get her some votes if she decided to run, and CEO of MyPillow, Mike Lindell, who Mike Lindell, obviously, very close ally of President Trump. If he decided to enter this race, I don't know how he would do in a general election, but in a Republican primary, there would be a very real possibility that he could win the Republican primary, especially if President Trump went out and endorsed him in the Republican primary. Now, some of the statements Mike Lindell has made in the past, I think would essentially give him really no chance at winning a general election, but in the Republican primary, with at least 70 to 80% of very big loyalists to President Trump, Lindell would have a strong chance in that primary. And if Trump endorsed him, that may even put it away. Now, it should be worth noting, though, that President Trump did actually endorse U.S. Representative Tom Emmer of the 6th District to run for governor. He was the nominee for governor back in 2010. Emmer ultimately declined. So before Trump did actually want Emmer to run, so that could be an indication that maybe even if Mike Lindell does run, he may steer clear of endorsing him based on that decision. But again, we'll have to wait and see how that all goes. Three other Republicans, Lisa DeMuth, Chris Madel, and Jim Nash, are also listed as potential Republican candidates. As for the general election race, it's pretty much big consistency here. Cook Political Report, Inside Elections, Sablo Crystal Ball, and Race to the White House all have the state listed as likely Democratic for Tim Walz. And when you look at the recent election history, we can look at Minnesota, the governor's race in 2022, it makes a lot of sense. Tim Walz won against Scott Jensen by 7.7% in this race. 7.7%, that would be in the likely Democratic rating of 5 to 15 points. So Walz won here by a pretty decent margin and was not really facing too much of a tough fight. The general election, the ratings were very similar. Most had it as likely Democratic. Inside Elections, and Politico did have it as lean. Real Clear Politics had it as toss-up. But for the most part, pretty consistent that it was likely for Tim Walz. The polling, however, Real Clear Politics showed it being a little bit more competitive, with Walz leading by 4.3% over Scott Jensen, so that would be in the lean Republican rating. 538, however, had Walz leading by 8.8%. That's more in line with likely Democrat. The average of the two ended up being around 6.6%, also in the likely Democratic category. And you see Real Clear Politics getting 48, Jensen 43.7. The actual result ended up being 52.27, Jensen getting about 44.61. So Walz ended up basically getting a lot of that undecided vote that was out there, consolidated support, and won re-election by a pretty large margin. That's what Walz did in 2022. Back in 2018, when he was first elected, he did win by a larger margin. So the margin did go down from 2018 to 2022, seeing as 2018 was a Democratic midterm year, 2022 was a Republican midterm year. Makes a little bit of sense why that happened. And this one, Tim Walz, we see, will first go to the Democratic primary. The U.S. representative won the Democratic primary. The polling showed actually a pretty tight race, with Emerson College having Swanson leading over Walz by about 1 point. The results, ultimately, Walz won by about 9 points or so over Erin Murphy. Lori Swanson finished in third in that. On the Republican side, Jeff Johnson ended up winning the Republican primary, including defeating former Governor Tim Pawlenty in the Republican primary. This ended up showing a very close race here, about 9 points for Johnson leading over Pawlenty in this race. Then going to the general election, a little bit more competitive than what 20 22 ended up looking like. A lot of lean Democrats in these rankings, likely Democrats from some as well, so kind of split on what to make this race as lean or likely. As for the polling in this race, though, Tim Walz seemed to be leading by a very large amount, getting 50 to 50% or more in this race, and ultimately Tim Walz ended up winning by a pretty large margin of 11 points. So now looking for 2026, Minnesota, the most recent election we have, was 2024, where Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, as the running mate to Harris, defeated Donald Trump in the state by 4.2%. But again, in 2024, where essentially everything broke in President Trump's direction, just to give you an idea, the only region of the United States that did not break at the state level for Donald Trump was the 1st District in Nebraska. Everything else voted more to the right than it did in 2020, including Minnesota, which voted about 3 points towards the right than it did in 2020. Based on that, we saw a very competitive election in 2024. Minnesota fell under 5 points. Harris won by 4.2%, even with Walz on the ticket. In 2026, it will be pretty much for a fact a more democratic election environment than 2024 was for Donald Trump, which should boost Tim Walz's chances and really take away any danger of him losing this governor's race. I get what the article is saying, that it has been a very long time since a governor has won a third term in the state of Minnesota, but Walz is in pretty strong position as the incumbent governor. He has the pedigree now among national Democrats as well for fundraising and such. I think we see Tim Walz hold on and win Minnesota's governor's race by more than 5% in the 2026 governor's elections. If everything broke against the Democrats, it's possible it could fall under 5 points. But again, in the 2026 election environment, it also does help that it should be good for the Democrats. So even if Walz were to be in trouble for some reason that I don't really think would happen, even still, the election environment alone should essentially bail him out and guarantee a more than 5-point victory. And again, depending on which candidate the Republicans put up, could have varying degrees as well. Right now, I think pretty much all of them lose by more than 5 points, but if Mike Lindell, for instance, were to be the Republican, it could even go to like more than 10 points or so, depending on how that general election could shake out. So, but again, I think Minnesota starts out pretty consistently in the likely Democratic category for Tim Walz. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you did. Leave a comment below. Tell me your thoughts and all that, and I hope to see you in a future video.